And we continue on in Chapter 7, Discourse and Ideology in Eagleton's book, Ideology. Now, we've seen some of the initial concerns that post-Marxism raises, according to Eagleton. Now, let's continue. Now, Marxism, in the more traditional sense, says, has a fairly strong notion of realism in the world, not completely, because it is ideas and action, etc., etc. But there do exist distinctions in society, right? There is a thing, society, that we can talk about. It's out there, and the theory is trying to grasp these distinctions. There exists interests and desires. They're outgrowths of places, right? So how people think and desire and their interests is, going to largely be related to their places in society. This is all, in sort of a standard, casual way, real, right? Okay, but how is this all related now? Right? Because if I say, oh, it's real and desires are related to real things, so you say, well, what do you mean by this related to? So the concept of a relation, right? If you study it, there's all different kinds of relations, and that's what we're going to unpack a little bit here. Is how Eagleton goes after this post-Marxism, which says that interests, like other things, this is all just construction, right? These are all just constructions, and that's going to be problematic, because if you think of everything's just a construction, first off, that claim that everything's just a construction is going to put you in the same situation as saying everything's there's no such thing as truth or whatever. Everything's a construction. Is that a true statement, or is that just a constructed statement? Or everything's not a construction. Is that a true statement, or just merely constructed? How would you refute the notion? If I say something like, everything is just a construction, you say, well, no, it's not. And then I'd say, well, okay, you show it. Anything you tried to come up with, I could explain away as just another construction and almost vindicating my point. So how would you be able to counter this notion, this claim? So this old sort of Popperian criticism of, if it's going to be a real thesis, it's got to be able to be falsifiable in some sense. And if it's not, is it really sensible at all? Like, if it can handle anything, then basically it's not really saying anything about the world. Okay, so that's one criticism he makes. He also says, now let's look at this post-Marxism's problem with the origins of desires. If it says they're all constructions, we end up in a kind of strange sort of place. Like interests, if they come from society, directly from society, we'll label that one. And according to the so this classic Marxism is kind of like they're from society, and then the post-Marxism says no, they're basically constructions. So we have this dichotomy, and he thinks Eagleton thinks it's a dilemma, because neither of these are very palatable, right? But he says if you think about this, interests as from society or constructions, you have to pick one. That dilemma is actually an instance of a false dichotomy, right? In other words, we don't have to say, oh, I have to pick one or two and just live with it. No, there's a third way. That interests, as Eagleton says, something like they have an internal connection to places and distinctions in society, right? So, okay, so now we've got another thing up and running. What exactly do you mean by, Mr. Eagleton, the notion of an internal connection? So this is an example of a relation. So they are internally related. Now, the term internal relation has a long history in philosophy, and it would be best not to go into that here, because I don't think Eagleton really means it in the way that I would read it. But maybe to a certain degree he does. But I'm not going to dig into that. I just want to try and clarify, I think, sort of what the essence is of what he's after, if I may put it that way. And it goes something like this. If we say that interests, like, a bunch of subjects, like people in society, they have their interests. Where do these interests come from? They've got a connection to a society and a connection to the constructive nature of the human mind. So these are not entirely right, and they're not entirely wrong. So it's a special kind of relation. Now let's think about this notion of an internal connection. Okay, so gamma. Well, gamma, an internal connection, is not really a causal relation. Okay, what's a causal relation? Okay, that I know lots of philosophers when they hear that they're going to look and have their own specific notion of a causal relation. I'm giving just a bare bones idea of it, just to help clarify this a bit. But it's a nuanced notion. Causality is a very nuanced and argued and contested concept. But let's just take it easy here and look at it this way. If I say something like X causes Y, let's use just an example without getting too philosophical. Like billiard balls, right? You're playing pool. So you got a blue billiard ball is zooming along, and it hits, bang, boom. It hits a green one. And so the blue one comes along, hits the green one, and then the green one zooms off, right? You've all seen this. Now, Hume, the great philosopher Hume, has a big analysis of how this works. But I think I can bypass a little bit by saying that if I were to bring you to a pool table and show you as I throw, as the blue ball goes zooming along, hits the green one, you're like, oh, well, the green one's going to shoot off. And if it hits it nice and evenly, the blue one will stop and the green one zooms off, right? So you expect that, right? And likewise, if I say, if I do something like this here, I'm standing there and I throw this pen at you, you're going to flinch. That's going to be a causal relationship, right? So you see the pen come flying to your face, you're going to do this. You're not reasoning about it. It's just a causal reaction, right? Pen flying, you see the pen flying towards you, you do this, right? You think, it's going to hit me in the face. You're not really thinking too much about it, but you're going to wince, right? So in that sense, there's a causal relation. There really isn't any thought. It's just sort of a kind of a something. There's a cause, and then there's an effect, right? It's very mechanical, right? So even if it applies to you, it's very mechanical. We use this a lot, right? And we use this in our moral relationships as well, right? Because we would say that something that's causal is not a reason for blame. So I'm bringing in a notion of reason here. You're on the bus, you have a backpack on, and the bus stops suddenly, and because of your inertia with your backpack and all that stuff, you go forward and you bump into someone. And they turn around and go, hey, and you say, well, look, was the bus stopping? People all know that's a causal thing. You didn't intend, you didn't want to, you didn't have a reason for hitting that person. No, it was an accident, right? People will say, oh, okay. But if you said to someone, no, I wanted to do that and I hit you on purpose, people would take that, well, that's not a causal relationship. You had some kind of intention or whatever. It's a different way of relating the notion of you bumping into someone. If it's causal, we tend to think of it as just kind of along this billiard ball model. There's no thought or whatever. But if there's a reason for, in this case, like X is a reason for Y, this involves a lot more complicated stuff here. It's not a real sort of naked causal relation. If I say something like, I don't know, why are you watching this video? Why are you in this course? You might have, what's the reason for me being here? Well, I have an interest. I'm getting the interest satisfied by watching this video, or not, right? But there would be some kind of notion of justification, anticipation. I'm in a course. What's the reason you're in a course? You could describe it purely mechanically and causally. Well, my parents met, and you can tell a biological story of it. But people would say, well, that's not the reason you're in the course. You're, like, why are you here? You could tell a causal story, right, as biologists and physicists do, but they don't tell the same story when we ask, well, what's the reason, which kind of suggests like purpose, goals, almost anticipation of the future. What's the reason I'm here? Well, I want to get a degree, or I want to get a good job, so I need this degree to get a good job, or I have interests that I want to satisfy. So this notion of an internal connection really is one of reason. So the distinctions in society and the interests of the subjects in those societal places is an internal one of reason, says Eagleton. And that's not completely divorced from the world, but not completely reducible to a causal connection. It's a more complex one. So in other words, when you say that it's a reason relation, this internal is a relation is a reason relation. You're saying, well, yeah, it's got something to do with society, right? It's got some connection, right? It's got some constructive aspect to it because I am thinking and imagining future possibilities. But unlike one and two in the pure sense, one would reduce us if you say, oh, your desires and interests and desires are all just causally related to position in society. That kind of turns us all into billiard balls, right? And so two people stuck in the same position would have the same desires, right? That doesn't seem to happen. We seem to be much more unique than that. But on the other hand, number two also, as Eagleton says, also tends to strip agency of us, because it turns us into just fantasizers. Like, oh well, my desires have no connection to my historical situation in society. That seems ridiculous too. So this notion of a reasoned relation connects both of these in a thicker, richer sense than either does. Connects both of these together and puts us in a thicker, deeper relationship to distinctions in society, that is, our interests and our distinction in society, our place, are related in a richer way than either of these options, right? So this, you can think of this as a combination, a more complex combination of what's going on here, rather than just turning us into totally in the world, no thinking, billiard balls being bounced around by society. That's heavily reductionist. Or turning us into fantasizers where we're just completely constructing things that's got nothing to do or completely or accidentally related, not really related to our place in the world. That seems kind of odd that a bunch, and because if you think about the ramifications, that a group of people who happen to be in a similar position in society, and if their beliefs and desires lined up, you would be saying things like, well, that's just wild because they're all just kind of fantasizing in the same direction. There's no link to their position in life. You'd be like, that's kind of a weird hypothesis. This is the essence of Eagleton's criticism of this being, like, we're not billiard balls and we're not just random fantasizers who groups that are in the same position in society just by some accident happen to think in the same way. And they don't even all think in the exact same way, because any, as we've seen in ideologies and any kind of political movement, there's lots of dissent, even within people who are in very similar positions. We're all quite individual. People who come from the same family, been raised by the same parents in very similar situations, can have similar views in some ways and very different views in others. So we're not just random fantasizers and we're not billiard balls. We are internally related to our situations. And so he says, okay, so that's why he's like, yeah, this is kind of over the top. And if you think about it even further, this kind of post-Marxism kind of makes everything a fantasy, all of society, everything, right? And in that way that Nietzsche, leads us down this path that whatever reality is, who knows? But it's just chopped up conceptually or pragmatically according to our interests, and the underlying reality is something we don't know. But again, he thinks, Eagleton tries to argue that there is kind of this sort of a simple causal view underlying all of this, both of these sides, in that sense that okay, well then the fantasizers, in this one just happen to have this huge sort of causal thing that's completely constructed, and that's how everything flows out of that, right? There's nothing really more to be said than that. He thinks that's problematic. All right, so that's sort of a rough overview to give you some shape of a fairly complicated discussion that Eagleton is carrying out here, and I think he's bringing in some terms pretty quick. And they're interesting, but it's not always clear what he means. So I hope I've clarified that a little bit by going into a little bit more of the distinction between causes and reasons, okay? And in philosophy, causes and reasons, there's a lot of argument of whether or not that's a completely viable distinction. It probably, many attempts to formulate it won't really hold up, but it seems to be a distinction that sticks around no matter what people say. All right, so he goes into a lot more of this notion of post-Marxism from Hurst and Hindness and sort of their anti-epistemological slant. I've given you just a bit of a flavor. Now, Eagleton then will turn to another couple of thinkers that also, struggle with this relationship of desires and distinctions in society, and they too think of it as quite a disconnect. But Eagleton will examine, and he thinks in the end, these next couple of thinkers were offering something that's a little more advanced, but in the end, he suggests that it's incoherent. But I'll talk about them in the next video. Stay tuned.